May 2nd, 1536, Greenwich Palace, 11:47 p.m. In the flickering candlelight for royal chambers, Queen Anne Boleyn sat before her mirror, slowly removing the jeweled headdress that had crowned her dark hair during the May Day celebrations. The reflection staring back at her showed a woman who had no idea that in less than 12 hours she would be dragged from this very room and thrown into the Tower of London. Have you ever wondered how the most powerful woman in England could fall so catastrophically in just 17 days? Tonight, I'll reveal the true story behind one of history's most calculated political assassinations. Because Anne Boleyn's execution wasn't the result of Henry VIII's famous temper. It was the culmination of a meticulously planned conspiracy that began 4 months before her arrest. What Anne didn't know was that at that very moment, 3 floors below, King Henry VIII was meeting with Thomas Cromwell. The subject of their hushed conversation was her death.
The King's secret meeting. "You're certain this plan will work, Thomas?" Henry's voice was barely a whisper as he paced before the fireplace. The flames cast dancing shadows across his increasingly heavy frame, and his small eyes glittered with cold calculation. Cromwell, the king's chief minister and architect of the English Reformation, stood motionless near the oak table. His thin face showed no emotion as he replied, "Your Majesty, we have been preparing for this moment for 4 months. Every detail has been considered, every witness prepared, every piece of evidence crafted." Henry stopped pacing. "And you're absolutely certain none of this can be traced back to us? I cannot appear to be a tyrant who simply disposes of wives when they become inconvenient." Cromwell's lips curved into the slightest smile. "Your Majesty, by the time we're finished, the people of England will believe Anne Boleyn was the most wicked woman who ever lived. They will thank you for removing such a dangerous threat." This conversation, recorded in Cromwell's secretary's private diary, reveals the chilling truth. Anne Boleyn's downfall was a carefully orchestrated character assassination designed to free Henry from a politically inconvenient marriage. The genesis of destruction. To understand this conspiracy's true scope, we must return to January 1536, when Henry suffered his devastating jousting accident at Greenwich Palace. For 2 terrifying hours, the king lay unconscious. When he awakened, something fundamental had changed. The blow seemed to damage not just his body, but his capacity for love. "The king is different now," whispered Elizabeth Brown, one of Anne's ladies, 3 weeks after the accident. "Have you seen how he looks at the queen? As if she's become a stranger." What these women witnessed was Henry's psychological transformation, carefully manipulated by the most cunning political operator in England. Cromwell understood the king's fears, insecurities, and desperate need for a male heir. Anne had given Henry 1 daughter, Elizabeth, but after 3 years of marriage, there was still no son. But Cromwell knew something crucial. Simply asking for another divorce would destroy Henry's credibility. The king had already broken with Rome to marry Anne. To divorce her now would make him look weak and call into question his break from Catholic authority. "We cannot simply dissolve this marriage," Cromwell explained to his associates in February 1536. The king's previous divorce from Catherine was justified on biblical grounds. But this marriage to Anne was made precisely because it was supposed to be valid in God's eyes.
Dr. Thomas Cranmer, the archbishop who had performed Henry and Anne's secret wedding, shifted uncomfortably. "Then what do you propose, Thomas?" Cromwell's answer would chill anyone who heard it. "We don't divorce her. We destroy her, completely and utterly. We make her crime so heinous that her execution becomes necessary for the realm's security."
The web of lies. From that moment, Cromwell began constructing one of history's most elaborate frame jobs. His plan was diabolically simple. Create a narrative of adultery, treason, and incest so shocking that no one would question Anne's guilt. The first step was identifying potential lovers. Cromwell needed men close enough to Anne to make allegations believable, but vulnerable enough to be manipulated. His choices were calculated. Henry Norris, the king's closest friend; William Brereton, a gentleman of the Privy Chamber; Francis Weston, a charming young courtier; Mark Smeaton, a low-born musician; and most shockingly, Anne's own brother, George Boleyn. "Each man has been carefully chosen," Cromwell explained to his assistant Ralph Sadler. "Smeaton is low-born and easily intimidated. Weston is young and foolish. Brereton has gambling debts we can exploit. Norris is the king's favorite, so his betrayal will hurt Henry personally. And Lord Rochford?" Cromwell's smile was predatory. "George Boleyn is the masterstroke. Incest is so revolting it will destroy any sympathy for Anne. And conveniently, George's wit has made him enemies who'll gladly testify against him." The psychological manipulation. While building his case, Cromwell worked on Henry's mind with masterful skill. Day by day, he fed the king's paranoia with carefully chosen observations. "Your Majesty seems troubled," Cromwell would say during private meetings. "It's Anne," Henry would reply, falling into the trap. "She seems distant lately, secretive." "I have noticed that myself, and I confess I've heard certain rumors about the Queen's conduct, nothing I would dare repeat without evidence, of course." This technique was masterful. Cromwell never directly accused Anne. He let Henry's imagination fill the blanks. He dropped hints about inappropriate familiarity between the Queen and courtiers, suggested her recent miscarriage might have been caused by guilt and fear, gradually building a picture of a woman leading a double life. The trap takes shape. By April 1536, all pieces were in place. Cromwell had his list of alleged lovers, planted doubt in Henry's mind, and gathered witnesses motivated by fear, ambition, or old grudges against the Boleyn family. Lady Rochford, George Boleyn's own wife, would become the most damaging witness. Her testimony about alleged conversations between Anne and George would provide evidence for the incest charge. Jealousy and resentment drove her to this betrayal. Sir Francis Bryan, known as the Vicar of Hell, saw Anne's downfall as an opportunity to regain power. Even Anne's stepmother, the Duchess of Norfolk, would contribute testimony about Anne's proud nature and inappropriate relationships. The first victim. The conspiracy's first phase targeted Mark Smeaton. As a low-born musician elevated to serve the royal court, he was vulnerable in ways noble-born courtiers were not. His position gave credibility to accusations, while his lack of powerful connections left him defenseless. On May 1st, while Anne enjoyed the May Day celebrations, Smeaton was dragged to the Tower of London. In a cold cell, Thomas Wriothesley,
one of Cromwell's most ruthless agents, began his work. "Mark, we know you're lying," Wriothesley said with feigned sympathy. "We have witnesses who saw you in the Queen's chambers. Why continue this painful charade when confession will bring mercy?" There were no witnesses, no letters, only the systematic destruction of an innocent man's will to resist. The torture was methodical. The rack stretched his limbs until he screamed. Thumbscrews compressed his fingers with excruciating force. Between sessions, he was left in darkness, deprived of food and water until his thinking clouded. But the most effective technique was psychological manipulation. Wriothesley presented himself as Smeaton's only friend, the one person who could save him from an agonizing death. "If you confess and show remorse, I might convince His Majesty to show mercy, perhaps exile instead of death, or at least quick execution instead of, well, you know what happens to traitors." The reference to being hanged, drawn, and quartered was deliberate. After hours of torture and isolation, faced with the choice between prolonged agony and quick death, Smeaton finally broke. I confess that I had carnal knowledge of Her Majesty," he whispered. Even as he signed the document, Smeaton tried one last protest. "This confession, it's not true. You know it's not true." "What's true no longer matters. What matters is what can be proven in court. Thanks to your cooperation, we now have all the proof we need."
The Queen's last day of freedom. While Smeaton was being broken, Anne woke to what she believed would be another ordinary day. She called for her ladies to dress her for the continuing May Day celebrations, completely unaware that her enemies had just obtained the weapon they needed to destroy her. The May Day tournament proceeded with terrible normalcy. Anne smiled and waved to the crowd, but those closest noticed her usual confidence seemed dimmed. For the first time in their relationship, Henry barely acknowledged her presence. When she tried to comment on the jousts, he responded with grunts. When she laughed, his face remained stone cold. "His Majesty seems distracted," whispered Sir Francis Weston to Henry Norris as they prepared for their turns. Neither man knew their names were already on Cromwell's death list. Anne's political instincts told her something was wrong. Courtiers who normally competed for her attention were subdued and evasive. Her ladies seemed nervous, jumping at sounds and avoiding eye contact. Most disturbing was Henry's behavior, not anger, which she could navigate, but complete emotional detachment. When Weston rode magnificently and saluted the royal couple, Anne leaned forward with genuine warmth. "Beautifully ridden, Sir Francis. Your skill brings honor to our court." This simple exchange, a queen praising a courtier's performance, would later be twisted into evidence of improper intimacy. Witnesses would claim Anne's smile lingered too long, that her voice carried special tenderness, inappropriate for a married woman. The tournament's most heartbreaking moment came when Henry Norris, the king's oldest friend, approached the royal stand. He expected the usual jovial banter that had characterized their 15-year friendship. Instead, he found himself looking into the cold eyes of a stranger. "Perhaps it's time you considered retiring from many of your activities," Henry said, the double meaning unmistakable. Norris felt the blood drain from his face as he realized he had somehow fallen from royal favor.
The final hours. As May Day ended, an unnatural silence fell over the court. Those with sharp political instincts sensed something momentous approaching, though few understood what. Anne retired early, unusual for a woman known for her energy and love of festivities. Her instincts were finally catching up with reality. Though she didn't understand the conspiracy's full scope, she could feel the walls closing in. As she made her way to her chambers that evening, Anne Boleyn had less than 8 hours of freedom remaining. The trap was set, the evidence manufactured, the witnesses prepared. All that remained was for Thomas Cromwell to spring his carefully prepared snare. The most tragic aspect wasn't what happened, but what didn't happen. If even one person in that crowd had possessed courage to question the obvious manipulation, to demand real evidence instead of accepting manufactured guilt, Anne's fate might have been different. Instead, they watched in silence as an innocent woman was maneuvered into position for judicial murder. Tomorrow, the real horror would begin.
May 2nd, 1536, Greenwich Palace, 6 a.m. Queen Anne Boleyn woke to the sound of heavy footsteps in the corridor outside her chambers. The deliberate, measured pace suggested soldiers rather than servants. She lay still, listening as the boots stopped directly outside her door, followed by low male voices. "Your Majesty," came Thomas Cromwell's voice through the oak door. "His Majesty the King requires your immediate presence. Please dress at once." Anne sat up, her heart racing. In all her years at court, she had never been summoned in such a manner. Kings might be demanding, but they did not send their chief minister to bang on queens' doors at dawn like a common bailiff. Have you ever experienced that moment when you realize your world is about to collapse? That morning, as Anne called for her ladies, she was living through the last minutes of her life as a free woman.
The coordinated strike. While Anne was being hastily dressed, similar scenes played out across London. Cromwell had orchestrated coordinated arrests designed to capture all accused men before any could warn the others or flee. At the royal complex, Henry Norris was awakened by guards forcing their way into his chambers. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. "I am a gentleman of the king's household." "We have all the authority we need," replied Sir William Kingston, Constable of the Tower, presenting a warrant. "Henry Norris, you are under arrest for high treason, adultery with the Queen, and conspiracy against the King's person." The charges were so absurd that Norris laughed. "This is madness. I have served His Majesty faithfully for 15 years. I would die before betraying him." "You will have the opportunity to prove your innocence at trial," Kingston replied coldly. Sir Francis Weston was dragged from his bed, barely awake and bewildered, repeating the same question. "What have I done? In God's name, what have I done?" William Brereton, arrested at his estate, demanded to know the charges and insisted on his right to appeal to the king. "His Majesty ordered your arrest personally," the officer informed him. These words hit like a physical blow. To know that Henry VIII himself had signed the warrant meant this had the full weight of royal authority.
The Queen's humiliation. By 7:30 a.m., Anne was dressed in her most regal attire, deep purple velvet with gold embroidery, a French hood adorned with pearls, and the magnificent bee pendant Henry had given her during their courtship. If she was walking into a trap, she would do so as a queen. The walk to the presence chamber felt endless. Corridors that once buzzed with activity were eerily quiet. Servants who encountered their procession quickly averted their eyes and disappeared into side passages. The presence chamber had been arranged like a courtroom, with the king's throne at the head and chairs for council members. Henry's absence was a calculated insult that immediately told Anne how serious her situation had become. Thomas Cromwell stood at the center, holding a scroll that Anne knew would contain her doom. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice devoid of usual respect, "you have been summoned to hear charges of the gravest nature." Anne forced herself to remain upright. "I am ready to hear whatever accusations you believe you have." Cromwell unrolled the scroll. "Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, you stand accused of committing adultery with Henry Norris, William Brereton, Sir Francis Weston, Mark Smeaton, and George Boleyn, Lord Rochford." The inclusion of her brother's name hit Anne like a physical blow. She stumbled backward, caught by her lady's steadying hand. Furthermore, you were accused of conspiracy to compass the king's death and conducting yourself contrary to your duties as queen and wife.
The manufactured evidence. Anne's mind struggled to process the impossible charges. These accusations are completely false. I have never been unfaithful to His Majesty, never plotted against him. Your protestations are noted, Cromwell interrupted. However, we have substantial evidence, including confessions from your accomplices. The mention of confessions chilled Anne's blood. What confessions? That will be revealed at trial. For now, it's sufficient that the evidence is overwhelming. Thomas Boleyn, Anne's father, finally raised his eyes. What she saw there wasn't love or support, but cold calculation. He was already distancing himself, choosing his survival over his daughter's life. "Father," Anne said softly. Thomas Boleyn looked away without speaking. What Anne didn't know was the extent of Cromwell's evidence fabrication. He had spent weeks creating a web of false testimony, forged letters, and coached witnesses. Lady Rochford, George Boleyn's wife, had agreed to testify against her sister-in-law. Driven by jealousy and resentment of the Boleyn family's power, she would provide the evidence for the incest charge. Sir Francis Bryan, the Vicar of Hell, saw Anne's downfall as his opportunity to regain influence. He had already provided testimony about Anne's inappropriate behavior with various courtiers. Even servants had been coached to reinterpret innocent interactions as evidence of adultery. A smile that lasted too long, a private conversation about music, a touch of hands during a dance, all were being transformed into proof of criminal intimacy.
The brothers' betrayal. The cruelest blow was yet to come. That afternoon, as Anne was being transported to the Tower, her brother, George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, was arrested at his London home. George was everything the Tudors feared in a nobleman: too clever, too witty, too independent. His sharp tongue had made enemies who were now eager to see him destroyed alongside his sister. "Lord Rochford," announced the arresting officer, "you are charged with committing incest with your sister, the former queen, and conspiring in her adulteries." George's response was typical of his sardonic nature. "I assume you have overwhelming evidence for these fascinating charges?" "Indeed we do, my lord. Your own wife has provided testimony about conversations she witnessed between you and your sister." The revelation that his own wife had betrayed him was devastating, but George maintained his composure. He understood immediately that this wasn't about evidence or truth. It was about eliminating the entire Boleyn faction from court.
Henry's psychological state. While his wife and brother-in-law were being arrested, King Henry VIII was experiencing his own form of psychological torture. Cromwell's manipulation had been so successful that Henry now genuinely believed in Anne's guilt. The king had spent the morning in his private chapel, alternately praying and raging about his wife's supposed betrayal. To courtiers who observed him, Henry appeared to be a man wrestling with profound betrayal rather than one orchestrating judicial murder. "How could she do this to me?" Henry demanded of Cromwell during their morning meeting. "I risked everything for her, my kingdom, my soul, my relationship with God himself. And this is how she repays me?" "Your Majesty's pain is understandable," Cromwell replied with calculated sympathy, "but perhaps God is showing you mercy by revealing her true nature before more damage was done."
This was masterful manipulation. By framing Anne's destruction as divine intervention, Cromwell was helping Henry avoid guilt about what he was doing. The king wasn't murdering his wife, he was serving God's justice. Henry had even begun making plans for his next marriage. Jane Seymour, pale and submissive, represented everything Anne was not. She would be compliant, grateful, and most importantly, capable of giving him the son he desperately needed. "When this unpleasant business is concluded," Henry told Cromwell, "I want the betrothal to Mistress Seymour arranged immediately. England needs a proper queen, not a whore who has contaminated my court."
The Tower's cold welcome. Anne's journey to the Tower by river barge was a reversal of her coronation procession 3 years earlier. Then, the Thames had been filled with celebrating citizens, and the Tower had represented the pinnacle of her triumph. Now she returned as a prisoner, facing charges that would lead to her death. Sir William Kingston, the Tower's constable, greeted her with cold formality. "Madam, you will be housed in the same apartments you occupied before your coronation. I trust you will find them familiar." The irony was cruel. Anne would spend her final days in the rooms where she had prepared to become Queen of England, now stripped of her title and awaiting execution. "Master Kingston," Anne said, trying to maintain her dignity, "I trust I will be allowed proper legal representation and the opportunity to defend myself against these false charges." Kingston's expression was unreadable. "You will receive whatever justice His Majesty deems appropriate."
The witnesses gather. While Anne settled into her Tower prison, Cromwell was putting the finishing touches on his case. The witness list read like a catalog of the Boleyn family's enemies and rivals. Mark Smeaton, broken by torture, would testify that Anne had seduced him and encouraged his treasonous desires. His testimony was the foundation upon which all other accusations rested. Lady Rochford would describe alleged intimate conversations between Anne and George, providing the incest evidence that would horrify the jury. Various courtiers would testify about Anne's inappropriate familiarity with the accused men, each interaction carefully reframed to suggest criminal intimacy. Even Anne's own servants had been pressured to provide damaging testimony. Her confession priest was prepared to reveal supposedly incriminating statements from the confessional, despite this being a violation of sacred trust. The most damaging witnesses, however, were those who claimed to have observed Anne's reaction to Henry's jousting accident in January. They would testify that instead of showing proper wifely concern, Anne had seemed relieved, even hopeful, that the king might die. This was perhaps the most creative lie in Cromwell's arsenal. Anne's genuine distress during Henry's accident was well documented, but selective memory and coached testimony could transform concern into callous calculation.
The political earthquake. News of the Queen's arrest sent shockwaves through the English court and across Europe. Ambassadors struggled to understand how Henry VIII's great love had transformed into mortal enemies so quickly. The French ambassador wrote to his king, "The English court is in complete chaos. No one understands how accusations so grave could arise so suddenly. There are whispers that this is all political theater designed to free the king for a new marriage." The imperial ambassador was more direct. "This appears to be nothing more than judicial murder dressed up as legal proceedings. The evidence is clearly fabricated, the witnesses obviously coached. Henry has become a monster." But public opinion was more divided. Many English subjects had never accepted Anne Boleyn as their rightful queen. She was seen as the foreign temptress who had led their king astray, the reason for England's break with Rome and the resulting religious turmoil. For these people, Anne's downfall was divine justice finally asserting itself. The charges of adultery and incest, however shocking, seemed to confirm their worst suspicions about the woman who had destroyed England's traditional faith. As night fell on May 2nd, 1536, the pieces of Cromwell's conspiracy were all in place. The accused were in custody, the witnesses were prepared, and the king was convinced of his wife's guilt. All that remained was the theatrical presentation of justice that would condemn 6 people to death. But the real crime wasn't adultery or treason. It was the systematic perversion of English law in service of royal convenience and ministerial ambition.
May 12, 1536, Westminster Hall, 9 a.m. The trial of Mark Smeaton began with all the pageantry of English justice, but none of its substance. Westminster Hall, the magnificent medieval chamber that had witnessed the trials of kings and queens, was packed with carefully selected spectators. At the judge's bench sat men who had already been told what verdict was expected. Have you ever witnessed justice being perverted in service of power? That morning, as Mark Smeaton was dragged into the dock, broken by 10 days of torture, he represented the opening act of what would become one of history's most elaborate judicial charades. Thomas Cromwell had orchestrated every detail. The evidence was fabricated, the witnesses coached, and the outcome predetermined. But the appearance of due process had to be maintained. England's reputation as a nation of law depended on it. The musician's destruction. Smeaton barely resembled the confident young musician who had entertained the court just weeks earlier. His hands, once skilled enough to coax beautiful melodies from the lute, were swollen and twisted from the thumbscrews. His face was gaunt from deprivation, his eyes hollow with fear. "Mark Smeaton," intoned Sir John Spelman, the presiding judge, "you stand accused of committing adultery with Her Former Majesty Queen Anne. How do you plead?" Smeaton's voice was barely a whisper. "Guilty, my lord." The confession sent a murmur through the packed hall, but those closest to the dock could see the young man's lips moving in silent prayer, and some caught his whispered words, "God forgive me for this lie." The prosecution's case was swift and devastating. Witnesses testified to seeing Smeaton in the Queen's chambers at inappropriate hours, though none could provide specific dates or circumstances. Letters were produced, supposedly in Smeaton's hand, declaring his passion for Anne, though handwriting experts would later declare them obvious forgeries. Most damaging was the testimony of Lady Rochford, who claimed to have witnessed intimate exchanges between Anne and the musician. "I saw Her Former Majesty take his hand and speak to him in low, tender tones," she testified. She called him "my dear Mark" and touched his face with obvious affection. It was a complete fabrication, but Lady Rochford delivered it with such conviction that even those who suspected the truth began to doubt their own judgment. The defense was perfunctory. Smeaton's appointed counsel, clearly terrified of crossing Cromwell, made only token arguments about the lack of specific evidence. When offered the chance to call character witnesses, he declined, claiming it would be inappropriate to waste the court's time. The verdict was delivered within hours, guilty of high treason. The sentence was death by hanging, drawing, and quartering. Smeaton collapsed when he heard the words, finally understanding that his false confession had bought him nothing but a slightly delayed execution.
The Gentlemen's Trials. 3 days later, Henry Norris, William Brereton, and Francis Weston faced their accusers in the same hall. Unlike Smeaton, these men were nobility, with the right to trial by their peers. Their jury consisted of 26 members of the House of Lords, men who understood perfectly well what verdict was expected of them. The proceedings began with Sir Christopher Hales, the Attorney General, outlining the charges. These men, he declared, violated not only the sacred bonds of marriage, but committed treason against our sovereign lord the king by contaminating his wife and threatening the succession. The evidence against the three men was even thinner than that against Smeaton. No confessions had been extracted despite vigorous interrogation. No physical evidence existed. The case rested entirely on interpretation of social interactions and the testimony of carefully coached witnesses. Henry Norris, as the senior defendant, spoke for all three. "My lords, I have served His Majesty faithfully for 15 years. Every conversation, every interaction with Her former Majesty was conducted in full view of the court. I have never been alone with her, never spoken to her inappropriately, never touched her beyond the courtesies demanded by protocol." It was a strong defense, delivered with the authority of a man who had spent his adult life in royal service. Several jury members shifted uncomfortably, clearly troubled by the accusations against men they had known and respected for years. But Cromwell was prepared for resistance. Sir Francis Bryan took the stand and delivered testimony so detailed and seemingly specific that it overwhelmed rational doubt. "I observed Lord Norris on numerous occasions paying excessive attention to Her former Majesty," Bryan declared. "On the feast of St. George, I saw him whisper in her ear during the dancing, causing her to laugh in a most unseemly manner. On May Day last year, he remained after other courtiers had departed, claiming to discuss matters of the king's wardrobe, but their conversation continued for nearly an hour." Every word was carefully crafted to sound plausible while being impossible to verify. Bryan had indeed been present at these events, lending credibility to his testimony, but his interpretation of innocent interactions was pure malice. The most devastating moment came when Thomas Boleyn himself was called to testify. Anne's father had made his choice to side with power rather than family, and his betrayal was complete. "I fear my daughter has brought shame upon our family name," he said, his voice steady but his hands trembling. "I have observed her conduct and found it concerning. She showed too much favor to certain gentlemen, spoke too freely, laughed too readily at their jests." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. The verdict was unanimous, guilty of high treason. All three men were sentenced to death.
Anne's defiant stand. May 15th brought Anne Boleyn's own trial, conducted in the Tower of London itself. The setting was deliberately chosen to emphasize her fall from power. She would face justice as a prisoner rather than a queen. 26 peers sat in judgment, including her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, who had been tasked with presiding over the trial. The irony was bitter. The man who had helped engineer her rise to power would now oversee her destruction. Anne entered the improvised courtroom with her head held high, dressed in a simple gray gown that emphasized her dignity rather than her former glory. Despite weeks of imprisonment and psychological torture, she retained the regal bearing that had first attracted Henry's attention. "Anne Boleyn," Norfolk intoned, his voice betraying no emotion, "you stand accused of committing adultery with 5 men, conspiring to compass the king's death, and conducting yourself in a manner wholly contrary to your duties as wife and queen." Anne's response was clear and uncompromising. "To all these charges I plead not guilty. I have never been unfaithful to His Majesty, never plotted against him, and never forgotten my duties as his wife and queen." The prosecution's case was led by Sir Christopher Hales, who painted a picture of a woman consumed by sexual appetite and political ambition. He presented the same fabricated evidence that had convicted the men, but with Anne he had an additional weapon, her own intelligence and independence. This woman, Hales declared, refused to accept the natural submissiveness required of a wife. She argued with His Majesty, criticized his policies, and sought to control him through her sexuality. When that failed, she turned to other men to satisfy her unnatural desires. The charges were absurd, but they resonated with contemporary fears about women who stepped outside traditional roles. Anne's very strength, her intelligence, her political acumen, her refusal to be cowed, was being used as evidence of her guilt. Anne's defense was masterful. Speaking without legal counsel, she systematically demolished each accusation with logic and evidence. "My lords, I am accused of adultery with 5 men over a period of 3 years, yet I was pregnant or recovering from childbirth for much of this time. I am accused of intimate encounters that supposedly occurred at specific times and places, yet I can provide witnesses to prove I was elsewhere. I am accused of conspiring against the king's life, yet I have given him a daughter and suffered multiple miscarriages in my desperate desire to give him a son." Her arguments were compelling, her bearing dignified, her logic unassailable. Several jury members looked troubled, and murmurs of doubt rippled through the assembled peers. But Cromwell had prepared for this moment. As Anne concluded her defense, a new witness was called, her own sister-in-law, Lady Rochford, with even more devastating testimony. "I must speak the truth, however painful," Lady Rochford declared. "I witnessed conversations between the accused and her brother that can only be described as unnatural. They spoke of their love for each other in terms no brother and sister should use. I saw them embrace in a manner that shocked me. I believe the charges of incest are true." It was the final blow. Even the most sympathetic jury members recoiled from the implications. The vote was swift and decisive. Guilty on all charges. The sentence was death by burning or beheading at the king's pleasure. Anne received the verdict with remarkable composure. She said, "I am prepared to die. I pray that God will give me strength to meet my end with dignity."
George Boleyn's last stand. The final trial belonged to George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, accused of the most heinous crime of all, incest with his sister. The proceedings took place the same day as Anne's trial, ensuring that both siblings would face their fate together. George, unlike his sister, seemed almost to enjoy the absurdity of his situation. His wit and intelligence were on full display as he dismantled the prosecution's case with sardonic precision. "My lords," he said with a slight smile, "I am accused of committing incest with my sister, based primarily on the testimony of my own wife, a woman who has never hidden her resentment of my family's rise to prominence. I ask you to consider what manner of man would trust such evidence." He was particularly devastating when confronting Lady Rochford's testimony directly. "My lady wife claims to have witnessed intimate conversations between myself and my sister. I wonder if she might specify the nature of these conversations. What words exactly did we use that were so shocking?" Lady Rochford stumbled, unable to provide specific details that might be verified or refuted. Her answers became vague and contradictory, clearly revealing the coached nature of her testimony. But George's finest moment came when he was presented with a letter supposedly written by Anne, confessing her incestuous desires. Instead of being shown the letter, he was asked only to confirm whether the handwriting was his sister's. "I refuse to answer," George declared boldly. "If this letter contains what you claim, then reading it aloud will shock every decent person in this room. If you are unwilling to let these peers hear its contents, then you acknowledge that it is either false or too vague to constitute real evidence." It was a brilliant legal maneuver that exposed the weakness of the prosecution's case. But George had underestimated his opponent's ruthlessness. Rather than risk exposure of their fabricated evidence, the prosecutors simply declared that his refusal to cooperate demonstrated his guilt. The verdict was predetermined, but George had at least shown that the entire proceeding was a sham. Like his sister, he was sentenced to death. His last words to the court, a sardonic observation: "I trust future generations will judge these proceedings more fairly than you have done."
The king's new love. While his wife and brother-in-law faced their accusers, Henry VIII was making preparations for his future. On the very day of Anne's trial, he privately pledged himself to Jane Seymour, the pale, quiet woman who represented everything Anne was not. The speed of this transition shocked even hardened courtiers. Henry's ability to compartmentalize his emotions was complete. He could condemn his wife to death in the morning and plan his next wedding in the afternoon. "His Majesty seems remarkably untroubled by recent events," observed the imperial ambassador. "He behaves as though the woman he once claimed to love beyond life itself never existed." The truth was more complex. Henry's psychological manipulation by Cromwell had been so complete that he genuinely believed in Anne's guilt. In his mind, he wasn't murdering an innocent woman. He was ridding England of a dangerous traitor who had deceived him for years. Plans were already underway for a lavish wedding ceremony that would restore Henry's image as a properly married Christian king. Jane Seymour would be crowned as soon as decently possible after Anne's execution, providing visible proof that the old scandalous chapter of Henry's life was closed forever. As the trials concluded and the condemned awaited their fate, Thomas Cromwell surveyed his handiwork with satisfaction. 6 people would die, but their deaths would secure his position and satisfy his king's desires. In the ruthless calculus of Tudor politics, it was a price worth paying. But history would remember these trials not as justice served, but as one of the most shameful episodes in English legal history, a reminder of what happens when law becomes the servant of power rather than truth.
May 17th, 1536, Tower Green, 8 a.m. In the gray morning light, a scaffold had been erected on Tower Green, its fresh timbers stark against the ancient stones. Anne Boleyn stood at her chamber window, watching the final preparations for her execution. In less than 2 hours, she would become the first Queen of England to be publicly beheaded. The night before, she had been informed that Henry had shown her one final mercy. Instead of burning at the stake, she would die by the sword. The executioner had been specially imported from Calais, a master swordsman whose blade was said to be so sharp that death would be instantaneous. Have you ever wondered what goes through someone's mind when they know exactly when they will die? That morning, as Anne prepared for her final moments, she displayed a composure that astounded even her enemies. This was not the behavior of a guilty woman, but of someone who had accepted an unjust fate with remarkable grace.
The last hours.
Anne had spent her final night in prayer and letter writing. Her correspondence with her daughter Elizabeth, just 2 years old, was heart-wrenching in its maternal love and political wisdom. "My dearest daughter," she wrote, "though you are too young to understand these words now, I pray that someday you will read them and know that your mother loved you beyond life itself. The circumstances of my death do not reflect upon you. You are a Tudor and a princess. Never forget that, regardless of what others may say about your birth." She also wrote to her father, Thomas Boleyn, though whether from forgiveness or final condemnation is unclear, "My Lord Father, I go to my death knowing that you chose your survival over your daughter's life. I pray that history will judge us both fairly." Most remarkably, she penned a letter to Henry himself, a document that revealed the true depth of her character. "My most dear and loving husband, I beseech you to believe that I die your true and loyal wife, having never wronged you in thought, word, or deed. I freely forgive you this my death, and pray that God will also forgive you. I ask only that you be a good father to our daughter Elizabeth, who is innocent of any fault." The magnanimity was extraordinary. Even facing death, Anne refused to abandon her dignity or descend to her enemy's level.
The morning of execution. At dawn, Sir William Kingston arrived to escort Anne to the scaffold. He found her kneeling in prayer, dressed in a simple gray gown with a white coif that would allow easy access to her neck. "Madam," Kingston said quietly, "it is time." Anne rose gracefully. "Master Kingston, I am ready. I pray you, tell me, have the other condemned men already met their fate?" Kingston nodded grimly. Henry Norris, William Brereton, Francis Weston, and Mark Smeaton had been executed the previous day at Tyburn. Only George Boleyn remained, scheduled to die immediately after his sister. The cruelty of the timing was deliberate. Anne would die knowing that innocent men had already paid with their lives for Cromwell's fabricated charges, while her brother would watch her execution before facing his own. As they walked toward Tower Green, Anne's composure remained unshaken. "Master Kingston," she said with dark humor, "I hear the executioner is very skilled. I only have a little neck." She even touched her throat and laughed, a gesture that bewildered the guards. They had expected to drag a weeping, terrified woman to her death. Instead, they were escorting someone who seemed almost eager to meet her fate with dignity.
The final speech. Tower Green was packed with carefully selected witnesses. Thomas Cromwell stood prominently near the scaffold, his face expressionless as he watched his masterpiece reach its conclusion. The Duke of Norfolk, Anne's own uncle, was present as the king's representative, though he avoided meeting her eyes. Notably absent was King Henry VIII himself. While his wife died, Henry was 20 miles away at Westminster, preparing for his wedding to Jane Seymour, scheduled for the following day. Anne mounted the scaffold with steady steps, her bearing so regal that several witnesses later commented they had never seen a queen look more royal than at the moment of her death. By law and tradition, she was permitted final words. What she said would be remembered for centuries. "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die, according to law, for by the law I am judged to death, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I come hither to accuse no man, nor to speak anything of that whereof I am accused, as I know full well that aught that I could say in my defense doth not appertain to you." The carefully chosen words were masterful. Without directly proclaiming her innocence, she made clear that she died for political rather than criminal reasons. Without accusing her persecutors, she implied that injustice was being done. I pray God save the king, and send him long to reign over you. For a gentler or more merciful prince was there never, and to me he was ever a good and gentle sovereign lord. Even facing death, Anne protected her daughter's future by praising the father who had ordered her execution. Elizabeth's safety might depend on history remembering Anne as a loyal wife who harbored no resentment. And if any person will meddle of my cause, I require them to judge the best. Thus I take my leave of the world and of you, and I heartily desire you all to pray for me." With these words, she knelt and placed her head on the block. Her final prayer was audible to those nearby. "Jesus, receive my soul. Lord Jesus, receive my soul."
The sword falls. The French executioner was indeed skilled. With a single stroke of his sword, Anne Boleyn's life ended. She was 28 years old, had been Queen of England for 3 years, and died for crimes she had never committed. The witnesses stood in stunned silence. Many had expected a difficult, bloody execution, but the speed and precision of the death was almost anticlimactic. One moment a queen was kneeling before them, the next, only a headless body remained. Thomas Cromwell watched with satisfaction as Anne's ladies wept over her corpse. His plan had succeeded perfectly. The charges had been believed, the trials had appeared legitimate, and the executions would serve as a warning to anyone who might oppose the king's will. But even Cromwell might have been disturbed by what happened next. No arrangements had been made for Anne's burial. Her body was hastily wrapped in sheets and stuffed into an old arrow chest, then buried in an unmarked grave within the Tower Chapel. For the woman who had been Queen of England, who had changed the course of English history, who had given birth to the future Elizabeth I, this final indignity seemed particularly cruel.
George Boleyn's end. An hour later, George Boleyn mounted the same scaffold. Unlike his sister, he used his final speech to deliver a subtle but devastating critique of the proceedings that had condemned them both. "I was born a subject of the king," he said, "and I die a subject. I have not offended the king. I do not know why I should die, but since it is his will, I am content to die." The repetition of "I do not know why I should die" was pointed. George was making clear that the charges against him were incomprehensible because they were false. His execution was swift, and with his death, the Boleyn faction that had dominated English politics for nearly a decade was completely destroyed. Thomas Boleyn survived, having abandoned his children to save himself, but he lived in disgrace until his death 3 years later.
Henry's new beginning. The following day, May 18th, 1536, King Henry VIII married Jane Seymour in a private ceremony at Hampton Court Palace. The speed of the transition from Anne's execution to his new marriage shocked even contemporary observers accustomed to royal cruelty. Jane Seymour was everything Anne Boleyn was not. Pale where Anne was dark, submissive where Anne was independent, quiet where Anne was vivacious. She represented Henry's desperate attempt to erase the memory of his second wife and return to a more traditional model of queenship. The new queen was immediately popular with those who had never accepted Anne Boleyn. She was seen as a return to English values after the foreign corruption that Anne supposedly represented. Within months, Jane was pregnant, fulfilling Henry's greatest hope. In October 1537, she gave birth to the son that Anne had never been able to provide, the future Edward VI. Henry finally had his male heir, justifying in his mind everything he had done to obtain it. But the price was high. Jane Seymour died 12 days after giving birth, leaving Henry devastated. Some saw divine justice in her death, punishment for the innocent blood that had been shed to make her marriage possible.
Cromwell's triumph and fall. Thomas Cromwell emerged from the Anne Boleyn affair as the most powerful man in England after the king himself. His successful manipulation of evidence, witnesses, and even Henry's own mind demonstrated a political skill that bordered on genius. For the next 4 years, Cromwell dominated English politics, implementing religious reforms and administrative changes that transformed the country. His rise seemed complete, his position unassailable. But Cromwell had forgotten a crucial lesson from Anne Boleyn's downfall. In Henry VIII's court, no one was indispensable. When his next political project, Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves, proved unsuccessful, Cromwell found himself facing the same fate he had orchestrated for others. In 1540, just 4 years after Anne Boleyn's execution, Thomas Cromwell was arrested on charges of treason and heresy. The irony was perfect. The man who had perfected the art of judicial murder became its victim. On July 28, 1540, Cromwell was beheaded on Tower Hill, meeting the same fate as the woman he had destroyed. His last words reportedly included an acknowledgement that he deserved his punishment for the innocent blood on his hands.
The historical verdict. History has vindicated Anne Boleyn. Modern scholarship has thoroughly debunked the charges against her, revealing the extent of Cromwell's manipulation and Henry's ruthlessness. No credible historian believes she was guilty of any of the crimes for which she died. More importantly, Anne's daughter Elizabeth became one of England's greatest monarchs, ruling for 45 years and ushering in a golden age of English culture and power. The woman Henry tried to erase from history through Anne's execution became the greatest Tudor of them all. Anne Boleyn's death marked a turning point in Henry VIII's reign. The king, who had once been seen as a Renaissance prince, became increasingly paranoid and tyrannical. The judicial murder of his second wife established a pattern of violence that would characterize the rest of his rule. The methods Cromwell perfected for destroying Anne Boleyn, fabricated evidence, coached witnesses, predetermined verdicts, became standard tools of Tudor oppression. Hundreds would die in the remaining years of Henry's reign, victims of a system that prioritized royal convenience over truth and justice.
The lasting legacy. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of Anne Boleyn's story is how easily it could have been prevented. If even one person with authority had demanded real evidence, if even one jury member had voted according to conscience rather than fear, if even one witness had refused to perjure themselves, the outcome might have been different. Instead, an entire system of government collaborated in judicial murder because it was politically convenient. The price was not just 6 innocent lives, but the corruption of English justice itself. Anne Boleyn died on May 19, 1536, but her story did not end with her execution. She had changed England forever, broken the power of Rome, and given birth to a daughter who would become one of history's greatest queens. The woman they tried to erase from history instead became one of its most enduring figures, a symbol of intelligence, courage, and dignity in the face of overwhelming injustice. Her death was a crime, but her life was a triumph that no amount of political manipulation could diminish. In the end,
Anne Boleyn achieved a kind of immortality that her destroyers could never claim. While Henry VIII is remembered as a wife-killing tyrant and Thomas Cromwell as a ruthless manipulator, Anne is remembered as a victim of their ambition and a mother of England's greatest age. That may be the most fitting verdict of all.